think I resonate with that. It's about being in constant dialogue. It's about trust with all your stakeholders and different parties. You talked about risks, especially in outdoor arts, in these large-scale works. What are the basic concerns, basic risks that you always think of or that you always need to prepare for? What are the fundamental risks?
I think the great thing about public space and the challenge is that lots of people can feel a sense of ownership in that space. When I'm training creative practitioners to make work outdoors, I put a lot of emphasis on the value of the site visit and the need to go and look at a place, not just 7:30 in the evening, but also go and look first thing in the morning, go and look at it at the weekend, not just during the week, because the users of space change. And the sort of people that are there first thing in the morning, which might be the lady who walks her dog at 7:30 every morning, she is the person who needs to know that you're planning to close that square because you're going to be building a giant baby and bringing all sorts in there. She's the person who could give you the most amount of difficulty or be your best ally. So going back to those places at different times of the day, different times of the week, and different times of the year, looking at a space in winter when there's no leaves on the trees, and you imagine the sight lines, oh, we could bring this down the hill and our audience of 2,000 people will all see that. And then you go back and look in summer, and of course the leaves are on the trees. You can't see the hill, you can't see the road, and the idea was ridiculous. We did a project in Finland where there was a huge river, and we got all excited about, well, we could bring a ship up the river. And then someone said, yes, but you're going to be working there in January, and the river will be frozen. And then we went, well, okay, then we could have people skating up the river. And they said, yes, but it may not be frozen. And it's that thing about you have to consider all the variables to do with weather, to do with the users of the space, but also thinking about the light. What happens is that magical time between daylight and dark can start to be something that you can work with. In theatre, lighting designers can do amazing things with light, but we, the audience, are often in the dark looking at the beautiful illuminated work on stage. Working outdoors, we're all in the same space and we're all lit by the same light. And that makes for a different sort of democratic process. And that can be uncomfortable for performers, but it can also be very exciting for audiences to look the performer in the eye as an equal.
You also touched on the weather factor, especially in large-scale city commission projects with such big investments. Yeah. That is something most critical to everybody when you've invested so much time, money, people, resources. How does that weigh in? How do you even consider not being able to do it if the weather, for some reason, impedes you to do that?
Yeah, and certainly in Britain, we have extraordinarily bad weather on lots of occasions. The way we approach it is to always assume that you will have the wettest, windiest weather for the show and think that through from the start. So always reminding the artists, whether they're makers, designers or choreographers or whoever, how will this work when it's really windy? How will this work if it's wet? When you make those costumes, how heavy will they become when they are sodden with rain? If you answer some of those questions early on, then you're less likely to get caught out. But it still happens. I mean, we've rarely had to cancel performances. We've modified performances, but usually because what we're doing is almost always one-off, there is only that one opportunity. What that means is the audience are invested in the risk as well. They know that we are going to make it happen, come what may. I don't know if it's the British are particularly stoic. We put on our anoraks and we put on our umbrellas and we stand there, whatever. I think there's something about if you are marking an occasion and it's 200 years since Peterloo Massacre, which was something we did a couple of years ago in Manchester. The rain was biblical. It was torrential. People still came because they knew that 200 years earlier, when people had protested, we were marking a significant protest by workers in Manchester. Everybody who came knew that 200 years earlier, those people had walked for 20 miles into the city, whatever the weather. And they came with us. I'm sure we had less people, but we still had huge audiences. We often put on the marketing, be prepared. This will happen, whatever the weather. So make sure you're dressed appropriately. And of course, working with young people, whatever you say to them, they still want to wear their best trainers, their little outfits, because they want to look good. So, of course, the big thing is participants who turn up wearing totally inappropriate clothing, and we then have to think about how to keep them dry, not the audience. Because we work with fire as well as working outdoors. We don't always use fire, but we work with fire and with fireworks. I think there is a degree of thinking about risk as something that you manage all the time. It's just part of daily life. And I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic has been that people started to have to really think about risk. We are going to have to live with that pandemic, like we have to live with the risk of, we live in cities with large amounts of traffic. In Britain, you're more likely to get run over by a car than you are to be, die at a walk the plank fire show. We are all living with risk daily. When we work with fire, and we love working with young people and fire, there's something about young people in their DNA is to indulge in risky behaviour. What we're trying to do is draw attention to the fact that with risk comes responsibility and the need to think about others, not just yourself, and to think about in advance, you have to think about how to play with fire safely. Of course, if you say to young people in Britain, if you say, do you want to play with fire? They go, yeah, because everyone says you can't do that. So how can you do that safely? What we do on our projects, we make sure that when the fire officer comes to visit, it's the young people who are telling him what the risks are and how they're going to manage it. So it's not the professional team who deal with the fire officer. That becomes part of what the young people do. So if we're working with fire drawings, we take time to show them the materials, we demonstrate what will happen, we ask them to think about what are the risks here, what are we looking at. They have to be the ones that do the risk assessment. And then that becomes a very powerful tool because they feel like they're being given trust. And therefore, and it's back to that thing, isn't it? The trust that you put in the young people. They're far more risk averse than I am. They make sure that it's absolutely going to be brilliant. We are in the background checking on all aspects of the project. We have the expertise that comes with experience. But if you don't get to touch and play with fire, for example, and do that safely, how do you deal with risks in your life that are less easy to control?
What you just said, especially about the weather factor, it completely makes sense. And I think it's a great reminder because we often go about doing outdoor works assuming it's going to be great weather. And so we often don't really have that contingency to make something work otherwise. Also about giving risk assessment and responsibility, risk and responsibility, they need to go together. I think that's a great reminder for how to approach works that has these high risks. You talked about fire, and really in all of your fiery projects, the fire garden, the fire drawings. Can you tell us a bit about the fire gardens project? Because it's in the garden. It's where people can sort of wander around watching these. And for the spectators, they might not be so aware while watching, they walk into something. How does that work? How do you assess that? And what really happens?
So the fire garden is a set, an installation. It is adapted to different locations. We have sculptures that are animated mainly by gas flame, although some of it is using wax or other fuel. It's mainly gas because gas can be controllable and can have a duration. So we've got beautiful flower boxes, we've got structures that create balls of fire at intervals. We have an arch with flowers that are mechanical and move in response to audience movement. There's almost always a soundtrack, and we try and make this layout of the garden, if it's in a park or a public space, the grounds of a public building, we spend time thinking about how we want the audience to move and how to create space for contemplation and stillness as well as mobility, because people love the fire garden and love the atmosphere that it creates, and therefore they want to stop. And that means if you've got people coming after, then you can get bottlenecks. So we populate the garden with technicians who have a costume like a gardener, and they are quietly keeping an eye on the sculptures but also on the audience. So don't feel like they are being managed by stewards wearing high visibility jackets saying, go this way and don't go that way. But there is management going on. It's more subtle and hopefully not too noticeable. What that means is we can create this world that is fiery, it's hot. You get close to some of those things, you can feel the heat. That's really exciting for people. We make sure that there's enough space so that if you're not comfortable with the heat, you can step back. So I think the key to how to work with a fire installation is to make sure that people have enough space to make their own decision about where to stand. And people don't go into live fire. We have to make sure they don't stumble and trip by mistake. But, human beings don't go into live fire. What we're doing as well is we are managing the access and the out. We're keeping an eye on the numbers. So we don't allow large numbers to build up, because we need the audience to feel comfortable with their proximity to the fire. What that requires, again, is a lot of negotiation, often with the park authorities or whatever. We have taken people to see how the fire garden works in another location. We don't serve alcohol near, so you wouldn't end up with an audience that are drunk. Although actually we have done it at a couple of music festivals, and that's not true. There have been audiences that are drunk. We then have more people keeping an eye. So we take account of the context, we take account of the likely audience, and people are then invited to come at a certain time. So the fire garden might be open from 6 o'clock till 10 o'clock, and your ticket might be for 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. You can stay as long as you like when you're in there. One thing to say, because the fire gardens, we had already had to think about distancing and how to manage audience. What that meant is last year, when very few people were making work, we were able to make the fire gardens. We had lots of fantastic feedback from audiences who had been starved of any sort of cultural experience, any sort of theatrical event. And then in that period, September to December last year, there was lots of fire gardens and light trails with fire garden elements. The audience response was fantastic. And that's because they felt reasonably safe.